So far too often, I think people don't know how to apologize.
Creating a culture that allows for mistakes and allows people to apologize for those mistakes without, without punishment, but still have accountability. I think those are great corporate cultures. And I think it starts with, if you teach somebody from the minute that they come in as part of orientation, this company has a culture of apology and accountability. This company will let you make errors, provided that you acknowledge that you've made them and you're sorry that you made them, and you're willing to go and be held accountable to ensure that you don't make them again. And that's how we view growth and development, right? Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that just a great place to start?
Ray Hennessy is the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Partner of Vocatus, a consulting firm for corporate and executive visibility. Ray has counseled and advised Fortune 500 and Inc. 5000 CEOs in messaging, marketing, and executive visibility. He was a financial news commentator on CNBC and CBS News, and he helped launch the Fox Business Network. Ray's book, Beyond Sorry: How to Own Up, Make Good, and Move Forward After a Crisis, was released in early 2024. Ray, welcome to Voices of HR.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we are so excited to have you here because this topic is way overdue in HR and every place else in the workplace. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It's a lot of HR departments don't know how to handle crises like this. And also, as you know, they don't even know how to handle when someone wants to apologize or how that can affect the organization. So I think the timing's great.
It is great. It is great. In fact, as a leader or executives that are listening on today, one of the key lessons that you actually learn the hard way, and I think you can back me up on this, is how to manage challenge and conflict. Because if you aren't astute at it, nobody is really there guiding you and teaching you how to effectively do it. In fact, I think most often we avoid it altogether in corporate America. Could you give us some insight from your book on why don't most people apologize in corporate America?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the fact that it's seen as an admission of wrongdoing that will harm people further. And it takes a really enlightened organization to create a culture that encourages apology, instead of people really kind of digging in on either sides of a conflict. When you say you're sorry, and more importantly, when you really are sorry, it's designed to open up a dialogue. But that generally does not happen certainly not in a lot of regulated environments, and in a lot of environments where, there's the legal implications from a workplace standpoint. I've personally been in situations, and I know a lot of people who have who have done something wrong. They screwed up. They messed up. Sometimes it's immaturity. Sometimes it is that they were just, having a bad day, or sometimes they did a bad thing, right? The impulse often is to want to make good if you're that team member, particularly if it affected other team members. But the mechanisms don't exist in a lot of organizations for that kind of response. What people do is they look at the act, and in general, depending on how bad it is, they try to figure out, the first question they ask is whether or not we need to terminate this employee, right? But to me, there's a range before you get to that point. That can open up a lot of great dialogue and can be great for corporate cultures that have that room for apology.
That is so true. And I always say to those executives that I coach, everyone makes mistakes. Everyone at some point in their career. It's the recovery that matters. And don't forget this, these are still humans, right? We're still working with people. And apologies should be a natural part of it. When
Yeah.
have you seen people give the best apologies? Like, what was the situation? Give us some tips and tools.
Yeah, I think when I was writing the book, one of the best parts of writing the book was the research, because I had
Mm,
known what I had seen firsthand, also like guiding clients through the need to apologize to repair relationships with clients and business partners that they had, or even some personal matters and things like that. And I looked to history, and there are
mm,
so many examples of when somebody came forward, apologized, and was able to move on. And I looked at what worked and what didn't. And the commonality is that the most effective apologies are when you mean it. Now that's kind of like a duh moment, right? It's like, of course, but you would be surprised how many people apologize and they don't mean it. And by the
mhm,
way, I would say that if you don't mean it, you shouldn't apologize. If you're not really
mm,
sorry, if you don't feel that, if you don't recognize the hurt that you've done with somebody else, you should not apologize. And I think the most effective people who have like reclaimed their reputation after like a crisis come not just from the strength of the apology, but the strength and the accountability that they create for themselves in terms of making sure that nothing happens again. So we are a nation of second chances. In some cases, we're a nation of third chances, right?
mhm.
And as much as the public likes to bring people down and point out the bad things that they do, they love a comeback too. So you look at people, who have undergone great transformations. What one in entertainment was, Hugh Grant, the actor, who was,
Mhm.
arrested. He was found with a prostitute in a bathroom in LA or something like that, and he went on a late night talk show and apologized unreservedly, to
Mhm.
his fans, to his family, for everything. He completely owned that. And then you have not heard similar things about him in the, decades since
Mhm.
that happened, right? And
Right.
his career is fine. People want to, look at the bad things that we do. People want to think about us sometimes as the worst. But if they believe that you've really learned your lesson, those same people are going to cheer you on for the most part.
Mhm.
So
They
I
are.
think history is full of those examples. In the corporate world, I was just watching Boeing CEO in front of Congress who
Mhm.
testified, and the families of people who lost their lives because of faults in Boeing aircraft were there in the hearing room in Congress. And he didn't have to do what he did, but he stood up, turned around, faced them directly, and said,
Mhm.
"I am sorry. I am sorry for
Wow.
this. It was such a powerful moment, and he didn't have to do it, but you could tell
Mhm.
that he meant it. You could tell that it was sincere. You could tell that it wasn't corporate speak. You could tell it wasn't lawyered. Um, do the families forgive him? Who knows? But it's not about forgiveness. Don't give an apology if you're looking simply for forgiveness. You're looking to
Mhm.
start the path forward on your own transformation, not necessarily someone else's.
Ooh, so let's take that a little bit deeper. So when you apologize, you're not seeking forgiveness. Tell us a little bit more about that.
You are seeking forgiveness, but you should never have an expectation of forgiveness.
Mm,
One
okay.
of one of the things I do in the book is look a lot around the language around apologies and being sorry and the
Mm,
etymology there. And forgiveness is what the word is. It's a gift, right? People are
mm,
giving you the gift that they're moving on from this. Um, it's a very, very tough ask. I don't think anybody who apologizes should say, "Please forgive me." No, 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 no. It's not up to them.
mm,
It's up to you to live a life through your actions and your words that let people know that the bad thing that you did before is not going to happen again. Sometimes
mhm,
people will forgive, but they often never forget, as the cliche is. Other
mhm,
times, people will move on, never forgive. That you mentioned that the title of the book is Beyond Sorry, how to,
mhm,
own up. And it's move forward after a crisis, not move on. Like people will always say, well, I want to be able to move on. I think the path is, it's owning up, making good, and moving forward. And when you move forward, that doesn't suggest that you moved on. You yourself should live with the pain you caused and understand that the people you've hurt, whether that's personal or professional, are going to hold on to that forever. But that doesn't mean that you can't move forward. If someone truly forgives you, it is the best gift you can ever possibly get. But you shouldn't expect that. In fact, there's some psychological research that suggests that people who push for forgiveness are actually compounding the harm. It's another pressure, it's another stress on that relationship. Like, why won't you forgive me for this? Or why won't you just leave me alone? Or why won't you move? You should never, ever, ever do that. And so I always think, don't seek forgiveness necessarily. You can look for it, but don't expect it, ever.
Don't expect it.
Yeah.
So this also then begs the question about accountability, which we talk about a lot in corporate America, right? Like we want people to hold themselves accountable. It's really hard to do that, though, if there's retaliation or retribution for holding yourself accountable. But as I was listening to you, it's like, yes, forgiveness isn't the end goal. Like the apology is the end goal. Forgiveness is just kind of a side benefit if you do receive that. But how does accountability fit in with this? Because I would think that's almost a process of forgiving yourself.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because psychologically, you cannot ask others for forgiveness if you have not first forgiven yourself. And part of the exploration that you need to go into is to figure out what motivated you to do what you did wrong in the first place. And part of that, I talk about like an examination of your conscience and what led to that. That you have to get to the point where you feel comfortable enough that you forgive yourself to seek forgiveness in others. It's like the psychological concept. One cannot actually feel love if one does not love him or herself, right? So I think that that's important. And then setting up a framework for accountability. It's not just, I promise I'll never do it again. Because the natural question has to be, well, what are you doing to make sure you're not doing it again? There were periods of my life when I used to be almost tyrannical and awful to people who worked for me, right? And I at one point said, this can't last. I will not be able to lead organizations if this is the way that I deal with folks. So what did I do? I hired a coach, right? The first thing I did before I even started like looking for new jobs or looking for different careers and things like that was, hire a coach for nothing else than to keep me accountable and to help me explore sort of what led me to feel the way that I did, to act the way that I did. And then also keeping that person close enough so that I had someone beside me who could say, yeah, that was not good. You shouldn't have said that. You shouldn't have done that. That was a little harsh, that kind of thing. And then I also felt as a leader very early on that it was important to surround myself with people in my team who can keep me accountable and give them, I was leading organizations, but I was giving them really the permission to say to me, no, or that was out of line, or, I don't think that was the right decision, or I don't think that, and I just made it kind of like an open season on me because I felt that having that outside perspective was really, really important. And I think so the combination of creating a framework for accountability that had sort of the personal professional coaching on the one end outside of the organization, and then the freedom to allow my team to hold me as a leader accountable was really, really important.
So that I was listening to that, and it's like that personal accountability and the self-awareness that you just described. Most people don't get that until maybe mid to later career. And I think that is a huge lesson that some of our early career listeners can take away, which is look at your own patterns, right? And where do you need to ask others to hold you accountable before maybe you make that big mistake and have to make that big apology, right?
Yeah.
So that was incredible. Let's go here. So far too often, I think people don't know how to apologize. They've never really been taught an appropriate apology, and they make bad apologies. Can you share with our listeners what a bad apology looks like?
A bad apology is when you blame someone else. The worst apology you will ever hear is someone who says, well, I'm sorry if you were offended by that, right? Think of that. Or I'm sorry that made you so mad. I don't even like, I'm sorry you feel that way. Like, people should never apologize or be shamed for what how they feel. The worst apologies do not have the ownership of the action. So when you say, well, circumstances are such that this happened and I'm sorry for it. Well, then why are you apologizing? We saw this in COVID, right? Remember the phrases early on in like March of 2020, it's like, due to unforeseen circumstances or because of, situations beyond our control, we're going to have to close and we're sorry. Well, you're not apologizing for a pandemic, right? I mean, it's like people weren't expecting an apology from you because you couldn't eat at their restaurant in those first couple of months. I mean, it was a nice gesture. It was trying to be personal, but they're not a real apology. And I think it comes back to the fact that apologies have become so commonplace, where we say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was 5 minutes late to this call." Using the word "I'm sorry," is that appropriate? And I'm sorry I had an affair. I'm sorry I said something I shouldn't have done. I'm sorry I committed this crime. Like, the word "I'm sorry" is used in a lot of ways, Berta. Like, I think about it like in the with the word love. Somebody told me I should write a book next called Beyond Love, because people, they'll say, I love this chicken parmesan, and then they say, I love you. Well, is it the same love? No, right? It's watered down, and the reasons we say it are different as well. So I think teaching people how to apologize starts less with the words and more with the meaning behind them. There's a lot of research on what makes an effective apology, a lot of psychological research. I've read it all. It pretty much comes down to whether it's a list of 5 things or 7 things or 10 things it's really just 2 things that people want. They want to know that you understood that what you did was wrong and should not have happened. And then they want what's called an offer for repair. So really, it's to make an effective apology starts with showing them that you understand that what you did was wrong, and then showing them that you're going to make good for it. And that's how you move forward. I love what you said about younger generations and people early in their work careers, because there's often a fear to mess up. I had a conversation with with a CEO once about an employee, and the CEO said to me, this person messed up, and I don't like her messing up. And she was lowest on the totem pole, entry level person. And I kind of shrugged and I said, we actually want those people to screw up. If I were the one screwing up, it would be a bigger issue. It would warrant that.
Right.
So again, creating a culture that allows for mistakes and allows people to apologize for those mistakes without without punishment, but still have accountability. I think those are great corporate cultures. And I do think it starts. You don't want workforces built on early generations of 0 to 5 year employees who are petrified of making mistakes, or who are afraid of what they're hearing about the mistakes they made. They're afraid to be, yelled at, but this is a disaster, this work, and I can't believe this is so screwed up. And that kind of language, that kind of culture shouldn't exist in like thriving, healthy enterprises. And I think it starts with, if you teach somebody from the minute that they come in as part of orientation, this company has a culture of apology and accountability. This company will let you make errors, provided that you acknowledge that you've made them and you're sorry that you made them, and you're willing to go and be held accountable to ensure that you don't make them again. And that's how we view growth and development, right?
Yes.
Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that just a great place to start for an organization? But tell me how many organizations that you've spoken with or know do that at orientation. How many even use the word apologize? They just don't. And I think that needs to change.
Yeah, they kind of go from if you aren't breaking it, if you aren't making mistakes, then you aren't learning. And it's all that kind of inspirational quote stuff going on. And then on the flip side, then you have, okay, how are you going to hold yourself accountable without the middle part of the apology,
Right.
which is part of the process.
Right.
And I love that. We do need to put that, add that to orientations. Explain how people should hold themselves accountable. When should they apologize? And what does that learning look like?
Right. And it's so funny. It just, I was at Entrepreneur Magazine for 3 years, and I would talk to all these startups, and they were exactly saying, yeah, we want to break stuff. We embrace failure. We embrace failure.
Right. Yes.
It's great. You embrace failure. You just can't embrace it so much that you don't actually succeed. So it's not that you embrace it. You can have room for it, but it's that accountability part, and it's telling people. And by the way, if somebody comes and say, "We lost this client. I am so sorry," it's incumbent upon the leader to say, "You should not apologize because we lost that client, because that was our team that failed this client, and we're going to learn from that, right?" Because it's also teaching people not only how to apologize, but more importantly, when not to apologize, so that you can concentrate on the issue. Very rarely in teams is there one person who does something so monumentally wrong that something adverse happens. It's usually a team of people. There's usually conditions for this. So I think it's incumbent upon business leaders to turn around and say, you know what, I appreciate the sentiment. I appreciate that you want to own this. We as an organization own this. And then you're reserving the apology for something that's more personal or directed at one person.
What should HR do when an employee does something that has negatively impacted other people on their team, maybe even the company, right? People are all over social media these days. Karens are all over social media. And I think you have some really good stories about what happens once they're videotaped, once they're put on social media. Tell our listeners a little bit about what typically happens and then what happens behind the scenes and what should happen.
Yeah, social has really changed the game. And we, as you point out, there are these videos of people who honestly I sometimes think are just having a bad day, and they go on a rant. And maybe they say things out of anger, but it doesn't really speak to who they are. And of course, nowadays, when somebody does something personally, what's the first thing that happens, right? People identify that person's name, and then they identify where that person worked, and then they go after the company, and the company knows about it faster than faster sometimes than the person themselves who was being videoed. I once worked on a client where they had that a woman was yelling at somebody in a park, and she didn't even say anything that was derogatory or anything like that, but her tone was certainly hostile. And it was, really not in character. And of course we got called in, and the client was, we were with the marketing people and the HR folks. And we were talking about the response. I said, well, what is your response going to be? And they're like, well, obviously we're going to fire her. And I said, okay, well, why? Because that's important to know too. Are there reasons beyond this other than you just want to protect your image to fire? And in fact, Berta, there weren't, right? They just wanted to be able to say in a statement and feel that they were protecting the brand by saying, we have terminated the relationship with this employee. And I was not convinced that that was the right approach, because I felt that, from a culture standpoint, maybe showing that you had that culture of forgiveness and apology within your organization might be good.
Right.
Allowing that person to apologize for her public behavior in her private life might go a long way internally and externally. Saying as an organization externally that you are going to help get this person counseling or things like that might be helpful as well. And so that happens, but it happens more now than ever before. And companies' first reaction is to cut it off and cut it out. And we're protecting ourselves. Right. But I don't think they think through the implications of what that means. That you're telling the rest of the organization, be careful out there. Now that's good. You should represent your organization well in all aspects of your life, because there is no difference between personal and professional anymore in a social media driven world. If in the old days you can go through a divorce and the only people who know about it was your own family and maybe a neighbor or two. Now people see it on Facebook, and now they see all the drama that's happening. And now, coworkers who are friends with you can see that all of this is happening, or your relationship status changes, and that becomes fodder for the workplace, right? So it's all mixed together. But I just feel like the knee-jerk response plays into some of the negative stereotypes that human resources has of being neither human nor a resource for their own employees, right? I don't think that you're fulfilling the need to care for culture and care for people if you're so quick to cut someone out. Now, obviously you have somebody who's, doing bad things and they're awful. Obviously that's, like that. But there are instances in some of these Karen videos where I do wonder whether or not we should show some compassion as an organization and help to heal a little more, other than cutting people off.
I think there's something there, right? Because I think you just said it so well. We're human and we're resources, right? And whether you call yourself people leadership or whatever it is these days, the essence is still the same. We're still dealing with people. People make mistakes, and it's all about the recovery and possibly the apology. I think that harkens back to individuals who are being encouraged to be their authentic self at work.
Right.
And what if they are being authentic and it is how they think, and they speak it, and all of a sudden someone's offended, or someone's feelings are hurt or whatever. HR gets them into a room. How should HR think about that conversation between two individuals where one is saying, hey, you told me to bring my authentic self, and I did.
Right. But and it's funny because you're talking about a gray area that I would say is 80% of these interactions. The 20%, obviously if somebody's authentic self is they're a white supremacist, they should not be in the organization. And again, I actually dealt with that with a client once, and it was simple, right? You didn't want this person in there because that was not good for the organization. It didn't. But you do have, I think, a sliding scale of what offends people and what doesn't. And in some cases there was one instance I remember of an employee, a fairly new employee at an organization who complained because a an executive there had like a lot of like a law enforcement flag, right? And went to human
Mm.
resources and said, I want that removed. And the chief people officer for the company said, well, like, why? Maybe we should talk about it. Like, he has family in
Hmm.
law enforcement. He's very much is not. And she said, well, I'm offended by the fact that that is there. And
Mm.
it would have been easy to say, okay, well, we'll take care of that, right? But instead, this particular woman, the chief people officer of the company, she had a dialogue and she's like, I get it. Why don't we get the two of you together and talk about it, right? And
Mm.
maybe you can both share where it comes from. And they did that, right? And by the way, there were no apologies given at all.
Right.
Um, but you know, I think in cases like that, you have a chance to mediate to make sure that people feel better about things. Because let's say that chief people officer made the person get rid of that flag. Well, that because of his family background and all the things that was
Mm-hmm.
important to the employee, took something away from that person for the sake of
Right.
somebody else, right? Let's say the person said, we're not going to do anything. It's you just deal with it, right? That sort of shows that you don't care. But being able to create a dialogue between these two people
Mm-hmm.
probably deepened the relationship that they had as teammates and workers. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the better approach.
So we have HR pros who are listening today, and we had talked at the beginning about how we were going to give them kind of tips and tools about really what situations really constitute the need for crisis management
Mhm.
when it comes to employees that are out there on social media. I know this is one of your fortes, one of many. Can you give us a situation where there was a crisis with an employee? Maybe it was an executive
Mhm.
where things went a little awry and HR had to get involved. Can you think of any situations like that where maybe the company did need to apologize?
Yeah, what often happens, and there's been a couple of instances that I've been a part of that have had to do with fraud, right? Where in some
Mm,
cases the CEO,
that's a realistic one.
yeah, yeah, and
Mhm.
that happens a lot, and fraud's interesting, Berta, because it always usually starts small, right? It usually
Mhm.
starts with, okay, well, we're just going to cover this and we'll, maybe move a decimal point over here, and next quarter we'll make up for it, right? But it always snowballs
Mhm.
into something. Um, and fraud is simple to commit in most cases. You look at like Bernie Madoff, you
Mhm.
look at Ponzi schemes. In retrospect, they were so simple, they were so easy to do, because
Mhm.
leaders are often trusted. We don't think that we're being defrauded by the people we do business with. That's why we're doing business with them.
Right.
So it never crosses your mind. So
Right.
you're so easy to get one over. But in a lot of cases, what you find is, and this is true of boards of directors.
Mhm.
Um, there are more apologies by boards of directors than there are by CEOs for bad behavior. Because in general, a CEO is not going to
Mhm.
necessarily apologize for that bad behavior, um,
Right.
because they committed it. And also, there's with things like fraud, there's usually a legal implication, and lawyers
Mhm.
don't like you apologizing until, ironically, after you've been sentenced. Then they want you to apologize because there are certain guidelines that mitigate the sentence that you get. But boards of directors often apologize, and their apologies are not about the fraud, but about a lack of oversight in that. And
Mm.
so I think that connection between the people who are the stewards of culture within human resources or the people offices at these companies and their boards is really
Mhm.
important in a situation when you have a top leader, like a C-suite leader. It doesn't even have to be the CEO. It can be the CFO, someone like that. I think having that direct dialogue between those governing the
Mhm.
company and those managing the culture is really important to figure out what the response should be. communications, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so very often
Right.
apologies look alike. We're sorry that this happened, right?
Yeah.
What's missing in a lot of these apologies is the cultural aspect that comes through the teaching moment in your outreach to clients and customers, and even in a lot of ways your own employees who have been harmed by these situations. So I often think when I do one of these statements on behalf of a company or on behalf of a board, I always seek to speak with the HR folks and speak to think,
Mm-hmm.
who's ever in charge of people and culture, because you want to make sure that it fits where you are culturally and where you want to
Mm-hmm.
go. Because let's face it, wrongdoing on the part of executives
That
is,
is such an
yeah,
excellent
yeah,
point because I always say the best companies that have the best external brand have a strong partnership between marketing and communications and HR.
yeah. And you, Berta,
Because what you're saying
you've
to the
run,
outside, you should be
yeah,
living inside.
right. In your career, you've been across that. You've had
Yeah.
roles across marketing. You've had roles,
Yes.
and
Yes.
the perspective that brings is important. And I do think that there needs to be that cooperation, particularly when
Mm-hmm.
the company's future and the health and strength of its brand is at stake. All those stakeholders need to have a seat at that
Mm-hmm.
table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Love that. So, from an HR standpoint, is there anything else that HR should keep in mind based upon your vast experience that we haven't talked about yet today that they should keep in mind when they think about apologies and protecting the culture and the brand? Any other stories or instances that you could provide that would give them some more insight?
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is I would love to see more people, either augment the handbook, augment the playbook
Mhm.
internally for companies, and also work with counsel where appropriate to start building better accountability, and better pathways to accountability for
Mhm.
folks when they make a mistake. We very often think that we've got a really great pathway to correct behaviors in people,
Mhm.
and that's through reviews and check-ins and things like that. And that could very well be true, but behavior is not as important as creating that a culture that allows people to do something wrong and make up for it and then thrive for it.
Mhm.
And I think that starts with the handbook. Unfortunately, as I
Mhm.
mentioned before, attorneys are not um, great about allowing apology. It's interesting,
Mhm.
in the medical profession. Uh, there was always a hesitancy to apologize
Mhm.
for a medical mistake.
Right.
But many states have protections over there, over that, which don't hold you liable if I'm a doctor and I mess something up and
Mm.
I say I'm sorry about that. That doesn't automatically mean that it was an admission that I did something wrong. And the reason that protection is in place is that the relationship between doctor and patient is so important that you
Mhm.
have to meet. There's a feeling that you have to meet them on that personal human level.
Right.
So you're allowed to do that in some cases, right? I wish more companies would realize that. I wish more
Mhm.
companies would realize that we need to allow people within an organization to have those deep human relationships with one another.
Mhm.
And so we have to be able to encourage the protection around an apology and encourage an accountability going forward.
For companies that are successful at this, I would suspect that you would encourage their executives to get really good at this, to have the
Yes.
high EQ around this topic.
If I would say, I would love to train a CEO in how to effectively apologize. And once that CEO does it and they see her doing it, everyone in that organization will know that it's okay for them to do it
Mhm.
as well. And I mean, that's the job of being a CEO, is to lead by that example.
Mm-hmm.
There's a word we also haven't used today, but we really should, because I think it's important in all relationships, but I think it's increasingly um, important in the corporate setting. That's vulnerability, right? We trust people around us when they are vulnerable to us,
Mm-hmm.
and cultures that support that vulnerability are the cultures that live in sort of the abundance of what they have. They are
Mm-hmm.
the kind that will help the people around them get through things. And so being able to have that culture of vulnerability and having an apology be part of that is important. So CEOs who show emotion and show vulnerability and own up to what they may have done wrong allows for a culture where everybody in that organization feels that they can do the same thing, and they
Mm-hmm.
connect more on a human level, right? We know that human relationships, interpersonal relationships, connect better when there's vulnerability. Well, that is true in the workplace as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think CEOs would be very wise to be vulnerable to those folks around them, and not feel that they have to be, these, ubermensch who just, are infallible.
Right.
No one is infallible.
Right. And I think as a executive, as a leader, you learn very, very quickly that most often you get a lot of credit for what goes right, but you have to stand up and have the courage when things don't go right and
Absolutely.
make that apology. All right. So unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our episode, but we have this thing called rapid fire questions. So these are quick questions, one sentence questions with one sentence answers, so that our audience gets to know you better. Are you willing to play?
I am willing to play.
All right, let's do this. What is the biggest problem you or your team solved this year?
We had the biggest problem we had a launch of a company that went awful on the financial side, and it was a wealth manager, and we were able to kind of get them to reset, refocus, and get back on track within a relatively short period of time.
If you could own your own billboard that would reach millions of people, what would your message be?
Uh, Open up, just, you know, be that vulnerability part. Open up.
Love it. What are you currently reading, or what have you read recently that you could recommend, and not your own book?
That was the easy one. I actually just reread Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, which I have not read in 20 years. And I encourage people to read it, because it also is a very good reminder that what we see around us as insane might be sanity after all.
Mm-hmm. So, as a CEO, why should CEOs give HR the credit that they deserve?
Because they are the number one outlet for what the CEO wants to drive culturally and community wise, and in an organization,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're like a lieutenant on an old sailing ship. The captain is nothing if the lieutenant isn't managing the ship, and that to me has always been what people and culture has done.
There's no company without people. What is one of the best or most worthwhile investments you've ever made in your career? And that could be an investment of money, time, energy.
It was starting a business that I owned myself,
Mm.
which I only did 2 years ago. And in I often say, in retrospect, maybe I should have done it sooner, but I don't know if I could have done it sooner.
Yeah,
I was kind of, pushed into it, and it has been one of the best blessings I've ever had.
we're so glad that you did. What's the main takeaway you want to leave listeners with?
don't be afraid to apologize. Don't listen to John Wayne who says never apologize. People think you're soft. The hardest thing that you could ever do is apologize effectively to somebody that you hurt. So when you can do that, that just makes you a better person, and the world needs a lot more healing right now.
We do. Today, we have been joined by Ray Hennessy, CEO and Executive Partner of Vocatus. Thank you again for joining me, Ray. It has been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.